Let's start with the serious business now. The keynote speaker of today is Thomas Fartmann. He's head of the Department of Biodiversity and Landscape Ecology at Osnabrück University in Germany, and also the chairman of the DGFO. His research interests focus on the effects of land use and climate change on biodiversity and how species richness of ecosystems is influenced by disturbance events. Today, Thomas is our keynote speaker, and his presentation centers on Orthoptera conservation in times of global change. Thomas, please.
Luc, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'd like to talk on our research on the effects of global change on Orthoptera in Central Europe, and I'd like to show what are the implications of our findings for Orthoptera conservation. First, let's have a look at our landscapes, how our landscapes look like. Here we see two fragmented calcareous grasslands. Here's one habitat patch, and here's the next habitat patch. And between these patches we have a matrix where the biodiversity is quite low, and such a landscape is called a fragmented landscape. And what we see is that the habitat patches differ in size. This one is quite large, this one is smaller, and they also differ in habitat quality. In this patch we have an abandoned patch, there's no longer any land use, we have encroachment of shrubs, this patch is still grazed, and we have open habitat structures, we have early successional stages, they are missing here. And here we see the main parameters that determine patch occupancy in our fragmented landscapes, and these are the area of the habitat patches. The habitat quality is the second, that is quite important, and the third one is the connectivity between the patches, the distances between these patches or other patches, they have to move from one patch to another, and in between there is the matrix, and such a matrix is everything but hostile for many species. And let's look what of these three parameters is the most important one. We conducted a study also in calcareous grasslands in central Germany, and we studied habitat specialists, leaf and plant hoppers, butterflies, and several Orthoptera species. And the parameter with the highest explanatory power, with the highest explained variance in all three groups was habitat quality, followed by the area of the habitats, and then by habitat connectivity. Habitat quality is clearly the basis for all our conservation measures, and connectivity, however, plays also quite a sufficient role, especially when we think about range shifts, when we think about dispersal. Species that want to disperse, they need a higher connectivity. On the other hand, especially in Orthoptera, there are a lot of Orthoptera species, especially flightless species, that are able to survive for longer time periods in habitat patches if the habitat quality is high, and we have consistently a high habitat quality. Connectivity is often not that important than connectivity. All these three key parameters have strongly declined in our landscapes. Habitat quality is decreasing, especially due to land use changes. We have abandonment, we have land use intensification, and there are also other stresses that affect habitat quality and cause a decline in habitat quality. The second one, habitat area, is also declining in most of our habitat patches. compared to former times, and the same is true for connectivity. There are also clear losses in habitat connectivity, and with these conditions, the species have to cope with in our fragmented landscapes. And I'd like to focus a little bit more strongly on habitat quality. We have heard it's the most important parameter in determining species persistence in fragmented landscapes. And we conducted a study in calcareous grasslands in southern Germany and Bavaria. And we wanted to see what is the influence of habitat heterogeneity on species richness in these habitat patches. And we find a clear relationship between habitat heterogeneity and species richness in these grasslands. And this is a general pattern. Yeah, the higher the habitat heterogeneity in a habitat patch, the more species we often or usually have. And on the other hand, habitat heterogeneity is also a very suitable buffer against climatic extreme events. If we have different aspects, north-facing slopes, south-facing slopes, east-facing slopes, and so on, the species have the possibility to move in reaction to extreme events, and so habitat heterogeneity also buffers such extreme events. And habitat heterogeneity is one important part of habitat quality in such patches. Let's have a look how habitat heterogeneity can look like. This is habitat heterogeneity in a very small scale. We see some microtopography, we see shaded parts, we see sunny parts, and on a much larger scale, here we have cattle pastures in the mountain area in Central Europe. And here we have different aspects. We have open habitats, we have shaded parts, and such habitats are quite good in buffering extreme events, and they are usually characterized by high species richness in our Orthoptera species. And another thing that is quite important when we talk about habitat quality is land use intensity. It's a key driver of habitat quality in our patches. Here we conducted a study in southwestern Germany in the Black Forest region, and we studied different types of grasslands, and the pattern was quite clear. We studied dry grassland, massic grasslands, and wet grasslands, and species richness peaked in those grasslands with a relatively low land use intensity. And it was the same in all three grassland types. Low intensity land use is quite important for many species, and that is also one reason why we lose so many species, because we don't have these patches with low land use intensity. Now let's show how the distribution of species changed in our fragmented landscapes due to global change. And one important study we conducted, that we focused on a habitat specialist and a habitat generalist. The habitat specialist was Orthoptera Orthoptera. The species occurred in the study area in calcareous grasslands and also in mire ecosystems. The habitat generalist, Röseliana röseli, is quite widespread and occurs in a lot of different types of verges or grasslands. And usually both species are short-winged. And both are short-winged, and in recent times we often observed long-winged individuals of the species, and we conducted studies in the lab and in the field. We wanted to know what are the drivers of microptery of long-winged individuals, and we observed that density stress in the first and second nymphal instar was responsible for the introduction of microptery. And now we wanted to connect this with global warming, with climate change. Why do we now more often observe such long-winged individuals? How is it linked with climate change? And due to climate change, our springs are often warmer. We have a lower nymph mortality, and this results in a higher population density. In our habitat specialists in Orthoptera, we did not observe any density stress in the field because usually the densities of the species are much lower in the field than those of Röseliana röseli. And so we don't have any range expansions. In the habitat generalist, Röseliana röseli, naturally the densities are much higher, and due to climate change now we have density stress, and this results in a high proportion of macropters, and we also showed that these individuals are highly dispersive, and they are responsible for strong range expansion to the north, also to higher elevations. And for this species, for this habitat generalist, there are a lot of habitats available, and so expansion is possible. If we would have as much macropters in Orthoptera, habitat expansion would hardly be possible due to the lack of suitable habitats for the species for this habitat specialist. Now let's have a look on the temperature requirements of the species and how this affects distribution changes in central Germany. We used data based on grid maps for Germany, and first we compared a historic period. That was the period before 1990 compared with 1990 and 1999. And species with a high temperature index, they suffered less from range losses in the historic period than species that are adapted to cooler climates. And when we go to the recent period, there the situation changed. The recent period was from 1990 to 1999 and 2000 to 2017. And we see that species that were adapted to cooler climates remained more or less stable concerning their distribution, but species depending on warmer climates, species with a high species temperature index, they increased, they dispersed, and they expanded their ranges. Now let's come to the farmland index. It expresses the dependence of Orthoptera species to high nature value farmland, and we have the same periods. During the historic period, most of the species declined, and especially species adapted to high nature value farmland strongly declined. And in the recent period, there was no clear relationship between the species farmland index and range shifts. There were not that severe losses in species adapted to high nature value farmland than in the previous time. And now let's have a look on dispersability and habitat specificity and the range changes and shifts. And when we have a look at habitat generalists and specialists, we see that most of them suffered from habitat losses, from range losses. The only exception were habitat generalists with a high mobility. They expanded their range during the historic period, and all others declined. And there were differences between all groups that we compared. And in the recent period, we had also again clear changes. We had no longer differences between the generalists and the specialists in both mobility categories. And species with low mobility remained more or less stable during the recent period, but species with a high mobility in generalists and also in specialists, they increased their ranges, and yeah, clear differences between these two periods. In recent times, we observed strong losses in agricultural grasslands, and this is particularly due to the cultivation of bioenergy crops. We conducted a study in northwestern Germany, in the northwestern German lowland, and we observed strong losses due to the conversion of grasslands to arable fields for maize production, for bioenergy crop production. And we lost in our study area more than 1/4 of the grassland patches. On the other hand, the verges still were present. There we didn't observe such losses. And when we have a look on the grassland patches, we see that the loss occurred only in those grassland patches that were not protected. We had strong losses in grassland patches outside the nature reserves, but nearly no losses, or no losses in the nature reserves. So nature reserves were here highly effective in preserving our grasslands, but outside it was completely the opposite. Now let's see in these patches, in the remaining patches, what are the responses to climate change and to global change. And we see we had a clear decline in the Farmland index from 1995 to 2012, and the same was true for the verges. And in contrast, the temperature index, we had a clear increase in both types. And yeah, the pattern we also saw before in the grid map-based study. The species that suffered most in our grasslands was Homocestus viridulus. It declined by more than 40% in the grassland patches and by more than 65% in the verges. And yeah, let's also have a look on the dispersability. Here a study from Western Germany, from the Eifel Mountains, and we studied again 3 grassland types: calcareous grasslands, mesic, and wet grasslands, and species with low mobility. There we didn't observe any changes between 1994 and 2015, but we observed clear changes in species with high mobility, a similar pattern to that we have found at our grid map-based data set. Now let's come back to our study from the lowlands. And here we have a clear difference to the study from the Eifel Mountains. Here we observed an increase in species with low mobility, and we explain this by the high connectivity of the patches. There are a lot of roadside verges in the study area. We have tiny grasslands, and we have a high connectivity, and in landscapes with a high connectivity, Orthoptera species are partly able to follow climate warming, to track climate change. And yeah, high dispersal species also followed climate warming and expanded in our patches. And at the end, I'd like to focus on habitat restoration. We have seen we have dramatic losses of habitat patches, and habitat restoration is increasingly practiced in nowadays. And here I present a study on the restoration of heathlands in central Germany. And here former spruce forests have been cut, the trees have been removed, and by hydroseeding, heathland seeds have been dispersed on the restoration sites, and we compared Orthoptera species richness in existing montane heathlands. here we have the restoration sites, and here we have the controls. The control sites, there only the spruce forests have been removed. That was the only thing that had been done. And what we see is that Orthoptera are able to respond rapidly to these restoration measures if source populations are in the vicinity available. And what we also see is that we had a higher species richness, and all of these species are characteristic species of heathlands that we found there. We see a clear management deficit in these montane heathlands. Most are relatively tall stands. We have no bare ground. We have no early successional stages. They are missing in such montane heathlands. And here, the restoration sites are quite heterogeneous. We have open parts. We have parts with a higher cover of Calluna and other characteristic species. So habitat restoration can be a tool to foster Orthoptera species and other species. Let's come to the take-home messages. Some, but not all, like it hot. And habitat availability and climate will determine the distribution of Orthoptera today already and in future also. These are the two main factors that will determine the distribution of our Orthoptera species. Concerning the macroptery, the response to climate change of the species depends on the initial population density of the species and also again on habitat availability. And habitat generalists are more likely to track climate warming than habitat specialists, and this is also again due to the habitat availability for the species. The winners of global change are thermophilic species, habitat generalists, and mobile species. But we have also seen, if you have a high connectivity, also species with a low connectivity can move northwards or to high elevations. And the losers are hygrophilic species and habitat specialists. And we had severe heat waves and drought periods during the last years, and nowadays it's so that there are also other species than hygrophilics that suffer from such extreme events and that start to decline. And I'd like to show some slides that show such summer drought events. This is a massic grassland in 2017 in August, and the same massic grassland in 2018. And extreme events will increasingly occur in our landscapes, and they will be responsible for species losses in many patches. The key factors for conservation are based on our findings. Habitat quality, and habitat quality clearly depends on disturbance and land use, and the land use regime, especially early and mid-successional stages, are clearly missing in most of our landscapes. And low-intensity land use favors a lot of species. Habitat heterogeneity is quite important for many species and for high species richness, and it's also a very well suitable buffer against climatic extreme events. Patch size is often related with habitat quality and habitat heterogeneity. The larger a patch, the higher the likelihood that we have a higher habitat quality somewhere in the patch and that we have a higher habitat heterogeneity. Connectivity depends on the population structure of the species. Some flighted species can persist for longer time periods in even isolated patches if they have a constant high habitat quality. But we have seen such extreme events and therefore connectivity will be quite necessary in the long run to conserve our species, so they are able to shift in response to such extreme events. And also for expansion of species, we need networks of habitats, and so connectivity is also important. And habitat restoration is one possibility to foster species, and it will become increasingly important due to the severe loss of habitats in our landscapes. Yeah, and I'd like to thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the grasshoppers for their cooperative behavior, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Any questions from the audience? Yes, please.
I have a question about the habitat restoration that you showed us. How long did it take for the recolonization of grasshoppers to take after that?
Yeah. We conducted the study 4 to 5 years after the restoration measures had been conducted. They rapidly respond, yeah.
Axel, sorry.
Thank you. As you know, we are doing similar research on the changes in Orthoptera diversity in Rhino-Palatinate, and we have similar results. And I just wondered, because of the term generalists, we use it still. We still use the term specialist for example, Statophrima grossum and Eudipoda caryolescens, who both have also massively expanded because they are, of course, very mobile. And we just wondered if they still can be termed specialists. Yeah, I think specialist is quite a subjective term which we use for species which are rare, more or less. If you go to southern Europe, for example, these will not be called specialists, of course, at least Eudipoda not. So I just wonder if we may shift more or less in the main part of the range where the species is adapted to more sites, and so that it's difficult to use a term in a long-term way.
I agree with you. We can work with such classifications. We have habitat specialists and generalists, but it's a simplification, it's clear. And another thing I also presented is the species farmland index. And there we combined the area of high nature value farmland in grid cells with the occurrence of the species across the German range. And so we have a clear gradient in this. And Eudipoda won't be a high nature, won't have a high species farmland index, for example, because you can find the species in cities, in rural areas, and so on. And there are different possibilities how to work with such classifications, and maybe such gradient analysis is the better way.
You mentioned this is similar question, like Alex, generalist versus specialist. How did you measure the threshold or quantify the threshold between the generalist and specialist?
We didn't measure. Our classification was based on Reinhardt et al., a paper from 2005 published in Ecography.
I have also the same topic, specialists and generalists. We made quite a similar study on 100 plots in whole of Austria and tried to differ habitats, specialists and generalists on the distribution about different habitat types in the whole Austrian database. And this is some, I think, a possibility to make it with some hard facts. So more than 3 habitat types for 75% of all data are generalists and something like that. But the interesting thing is we have the same proportion of specialists in the increasing part of the species as in the decreasing part, and a significantly lower amount of specialists in the stable ones. So we have very expensive specialists too, so
Yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
in our case,
Yeah,
it's
no,
not
no
so,
problem,
so
especially
clear.
if they are highly mobile, if they're capable of flight, and yeah.
There's one question by Klaus Rede online, and it's more like a technical question. People are asking questions in the room, if they can repeat their name so that people online can know who asked the question. That's the suggestion of Klaus Rede.
Okay. Okay, Armin Landman here. Hi. You connected an alleged density stress with an alleged increase in macroptery. Wouldn't you think that in former times, when overall landscape had much more quality, agricultural landscape had more connectivity, we would have expected more density stress and thus more macroptery, especially, for instance, in Röseli?
No, I would have expected this, and there are no indications that it was like this, because in former times these macropters were quite rare, and especially in the last 10 or 15 years we had macropters quite often, and in some populations more than 45% of the population were macropters, and our results are relatively clear that we need really high densities and really low. These high densities are only possible if we have sufficient food and we have warm temperature, the combination of both. And in former times we had sufficient food and good conditions in many of the low intensity grasslands, but no, there's no indication that the densities were as high as often nowadays, yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's time for one more question, if anybody has a last question.
I have a question from Howard Ree online. How 2018 drought affected future generation of Orthoptera from only 2018 generation? It may be that only the next generation from the 2018 population will be affected. Is that a clear question?
Such drought events will cause effects, clearly. And I would assume that we have losses in the next generation, clearly. But today we don't have sufficient data to say how long these effects will be visible and what will that mean for in the long run. And yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Thomas.
Yeah.